Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader, and today I am doing a reading wrap-up, which I haven't done in a little while. Last time I did that was in May, so now 2.5 months have passed, so I thought that I could do another reading wrap-up. Since the last reading wrap-up, I have read another 16 books, so I thought I would talk about them a little. And as you know, if you've seen the update video, there's been some changes to the channel. So although I'm still gonna continue to read some fiction, although I read more non-fiction than fiction, the fiction I read about will be exclusively talked about in these live streams. I won't review them. Um, but a lot of the non-fiction stuff I'm reading. Hello, my father. Hello, William. Hello, father. But a lot of the non-fiction that I read, I'm gonna still review, mainly the geopolitics stuff. So there are wide variety of books to talk about. Of course, I don't have most of them with me. Most of these books are in other countries. So let's start this list. Williams Library, greetings. Hello, Williams Library. So the first book I read since the last wrap-up, I talked about it briefly in the previous wrap-up, was The Terminal Man by Michael Crichton, which I actually turned out to really like. So it would be in the upper tier books of Michael Crichton books I've read. I would say it's a high 9, almost a 10, because it's a lot of thrills, it's a lot of interesting sci-fi. So I like that book, and that's a classic Michael Crichton book, The Terminal Man, that was written in the 1970s. And it's the story of a guy who's experimented on so that he stops acting crazy, but the experiments turn him into a psychopath who goes on a murdering rampage. And yeah, a lot of thrills, but some interesting sci-fi also in that book. Next book I read was, it's a French book actually, a French book that's almost 300 years old. It's called Histoire de Charles le XII, and it's written by the French Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire, and it's a book history biography of the Swedish king in the early 18th century, I think it was, Charles XII, and it talks about he was king of Sweden, and it talks about his conquests. He was involved a bunch in Poland, but he fought against the likes of Peter the Great in Russia, so he actually lost the war to Russia. So that's what the book is about a lot, and also how he hides in exile in Turkey for a while, and then he eventually dies in Norway or something like that. So it wasn't an easy read, but there was some interesting stuff still in that book. But it's written in French, and it's almost 300 years old, so that was not an easy read. Next up, I read Fort Pillow by Harry Turtlelove. This was a historical fiction book, actually, but feels a bit like alternate history. Williams Library. Sweden has not been at war since 1815. Yes, that is true, Williams Library. And since 1815, they were neutral, but now this is changing in 2023. So, yes, Sweden was stable for 200 years, no wars. During World War II, they were neutral, although neutral countries during World War II did collaborate with both sides, so they were still involved kind of in the war. Yeah. But the next book I read was Fort Pillow by Harry Turtlelove, which is a historical fiction American Civil War book, which I really like. It's maybe my favorite. I think it's my favorite Harry Turtlelove standalone book. It was very well written. He really writes He really writes Civil War stuff very well. My father, thanks to Putin, no longer neutral. Yeah. We used to have a few neutral countries in Europe, but now they're pretty much all joining NATO now. So this is filmed, by the way, in Finland, since that's one of my home countries. So I'm at my summer house in Finland, and I'm also on one of the demilitarized islands here on the Åland archipelago. But Finland is now in NATO, actually. So even though they were neutral after World War II and kind of Soviet aligned, now they're no longer now they can no longer be a Russian satellite. Now they're independent and they're backed by NATO, which is nice. We no longer have to fear being attacked by Russia. And anyways, there's a bunch of hunters here, so I don't know how well they would fare, those Russians here. But that Fort Pillow book, Civil War, was very well written. It's quite gripping. It's horrible in that book. There's a battle at Fort Pillow between the Americans and the Confederates, but in the Americans, half of them are blacks. And since there are a lot more Confederates than Americans, then it becomes more of a slaughter than a battle. And you have a bunch of Americans, especially blacks, who are killed when trying to surrender. So that's quite a brutal story. But it's also nuanced in Harry Turtle Love's way. So I really like that book, Fort Pillow. So if you want to read some good historical fiction about the American Civil War, you should check that out, Fort Pillow by Harry Turtle Love. There's also an interesting historical note at the end where it talks about the historiography on the Battle of Fort Pillow and the sources that he was inspired by, which kind of contradict each other, because there's sources based on American propaganda, and then there's lost cause Confederates who are very sympathetic to the Confederacy also wrote about that. So yeah. Next book is that I read is a history book that I really liked, which is called The Virginia Dynasty by Lynn Cheney. Now, Williams Library. The Finns held back the Soviets in the Winter War of 1939. They're fine even without NATO. Yeah, Williams Library. So a few years ago in high school, I did write a small research paper of maybe 1,000 words or 800 words on the Winter War. And it is true, the Finns held back the Soviets. And they did have some very good military strategy, moti and things like that, attacking Russians on skis from the forest and then getting out of there. But the reason the Russians sucked so much in Finland was that they had bad military strategy where they attacked, for example, everywhere instead of just focusing on the cities. So when the Soviets actually changed their military strategy in early 1940, then they advanced more quickly. So that's why the Finns actually ended up losing some territory. Technically, the Finns lost that war. And they lost some territory, but they fought so well that the Soviets respected them. So they basically left most of their sovereignty alone. But yeah, so it's true the Finns fought off the Soviets, but if they hadn't made peace, it wouldn't have worked well. Vitikol, well, that Vitikol, oh hey Vitikol, I haven't seen you before. Well, that was when almost every Soviet general was purged. Oh yeah, I think the guy in charge of the Soviet war was initially a sycophant, and then they put someone in charge who wasn't as sycophantic to run the campaign, and it went a lot better. And the Winter War also encouraged Hitler a lot more with Operation Barbarossa. He saw, okay, the Soviets suck at war in Finland, so that means they're gonna fall apart like a house of cards when we invade in 1941. So you see how you can have a ripple in history where the Soviets don't really win the Winter War, encouraging the Nazis to attack them. But the next history book I read was a history book, The Virginia Dynasty by Lynn Cheney, who's the wife, by the way, of former Vice President Dick Cheney under George W. Bush. And it's a good history book about several of the American founding fathers. It covers American history basically from the American Revolution, some battles during the Revolutionary War, all the way up to the presidency of James Monroe. So it basically covers the presidencies also of Washington, Adams, but from the perspective of the opposition, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. And these were brilliant statesmen, although they were rivals in some sense, and they had some competition, and there was argument about the Constitution and different things, and you did have war with Britain during this time. And most of these men, they almost ended quite poorly. So although they did a great service to the country, they did not necessarily die happy people. And they left very little to their children for the most part. They were almost bankrupt. So yeah, that was an interesting history book. If you want to learn about American history the first 50 years or so, then I greatly recommend you the Virginia Dynasty. Next book is a geopolitics book that I didn't like at all. And that is the Next 100 Years by Stratford founder George Friedman. And this is a book about the next 100 years in geopolitics. And the reason I don't like this geopolitics book is that it talks seriously about that there's gonna be a war on one side between Poland and the United States, and then on the other between Japan and Turkey. And these all are countries that are allies, so you're not gonna have a war with them. So I didn't like that book. It was interesting and there was some interesting stuff, but yes, I don't know how Stratford does the research sometimes. They just make predictions and predictions and they keep being wrong. They keep predicting that China is gonna collapse, but they never do. China's being fine and continue to grow for the past tens and tens of years. They claim that, I think it's 2005, they thought that the Chinese economy would have a recession in maybe 2010 and nothing happened. So yeah, I don't trust Stratford that much. Next book I read was a really good Austrian economics book, Individualism and Economic Order by F.A. Hayek. And this is just a bunch of essays on economics and how you should think about it, and it's a bit philosophical, but I did some economics in high school, so I understood it for the most part, although there was some complicated language. But there are 3 interesting chapters that explains why socialist calculation doesn't work that well. It also seriously discusses and explores different possibilities that government and the market works, and how knowledge in society also works. So a lot of interesting essays, although they're not all easy reads. But they're not that hard of reads. Next book is The Penultimate Truth by Philip K. Dick, which is a sci-fi dystopia book, kind of, where people claim there's been a nuclear war, everyone's hiding in holes underground, but things are going fine actually above Earth, and there's some guy who's trying to come up to the Earth and reveal the truth to everyone and let everyone leave their hole. Now, I've read 3 Philip K. Dick's books so far, and I've only really liked one, the Blade Runner, or Why Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. This one, The Penultimate Truth, I did not like that much. It was a bit dry and boring. There was some interesting elements. I gave it 3 stars on Goodreads, but I would not recommend it. Yeah, it was a short book, but it took me a while to read it. I took my time to read it. By the way, now in recent months, I've actually DNF'd a couple of books. So one book that I did start to read, but I stopped reading after 100 pages or so, was La Société Féodale by Marc Bloch, which is a history of feudal society by a French annals historian. And it was written back in 1940, and I did not like that book. It's written in very small script, and it's over 600 pages. I read the first, 120, 140 pages or so, then I just gave up because my eyes just got bored from reading that history. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's pretty clear to me that the only history that for the most part interests me is history in the last 300 years especially, and then to a limited extent the ancient world. But the Middle Ages is the most boring part of history, especially if it's written by a French historian 80 years ago. Another book, by the way, that I DNF'd, that I showed in my previous live stream with my father, that I actually got in Quebec, was The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And this book is about some explorers going to some place in the deep Amazon forest in South America, and they start seeing dinosaurs there and weird creatures. Now, I tried to read this book and I made it about halfway through, so 120 pages in or so, but it was another boring classic for me, so I stopped reading it. So yeah, that's another book I've DNF'd. Now when I start reading a book and after 100 pages, if I don't enjoy it, I'm not gonna usually bother finishing it unless there's really an interesting element. So yeah, the next book I did finish reading was, and I read it for the most part in Canada, was From a Buick 8 by Stephen King. And this is a book that has clear Dark Tower and Stephen King multiverse connections. So it's connected somehow to The Mist, although I'm not sure how. So this is a book basically about a young guy. His father got killed as a cop, and then he hangs around other cops and he becomes a cop himself. And there's this weird garage where they have this weird car where weird stuff happens, weird creatures and plants and things like that come out of it. There's blazing lights from it from time to time, and it's a weird book, which I liked for the most part. There are a few boring moments, but for the most part it was interesting fantasy, although you're not really sure how it's connected to the Stephen King multiverse, but it's connected somehow. Some of the creatures certainly remind you of The Mist in it, and there was some good horror in it. So it's it's a middling, which means good Stephen King book. Williams Library. When DNF, I do it very quickly before 100 pages. A former teacher of mine once said, if you don't like the first 8 or 12 pages, put the book down. Yeah, Williams Library. It's just that if I've bought a book, I'm gonna feel really dumb if I stopped reading it after 10 pages. So I try to give it 100 pages or so, and if I still don't like it, then I stop reading it. But there's one book I read, and I'm gonna talk about it soon. I didn't like it that much. I have the sequel, but I'm not gonna read it because I didn't like it, enjoy it enough. Next book I read was To Hell and Back by Ian Kershaw, which is a really good history book, really well written, generalist history of Europe from 1914 to, what was it, 1949? So it covers both world wars, the beginning of the Cold War and the interwar period. And it was very interesting. So I like to learn about how democracies rise and falls, and there are a bunch of paragraphs in this book that talks about the development of democracy in Greece or Romania or all throughout Europe, and then how it collapsed. So it's a general history of Europe. It's a sequel to Richard Evans. What's it called? Richard Evans, The Pursuit of Power. I read that last year. It's a shorter book. It's about 500 pages, and I really like that book. It was pretty objective, actually, so it did distinguish between how fascism and National Socialism is different in a sense, even if he kind of lumps them together. The only thing he kind of misunderstands is the Great Depression. He oversimplifies that a bit, but for the most part, Ian Kershaw is very objective when talking about the course of history from 1914 to 1949. And he distinguishes really well between dynamic totalitarianism, which is what the Soviet Union and Mussolini and which is what Soviet Union and especially Nazi Germany had, compared to conservative authoritarianism, which is on authoritarian regimes in the 20s and 30s that you had in Estonia or Romania or Hungary for the most part, or in other countries in East Central Europe. And they were authoritarian, but they were not totalitarian. They were conservative and status quo powers. Dynamic dictatorships like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany were not status quo powers. They were seeking to reform in very drastic ways. So, yeah. Moving on to next book, there's Super Freakonomics, written by Stephen Dubner and Steve Levitt. And this is a sequel to Freakonomics, which I reviewed 3 years ago, although I did not review Super Freakonomics. If anyone would be interested in me making a review of that later, you could mention it in the comments below. But it's weird. But Freakonomics books is just economics, but a bit weird. Talks about incentives a lot and looks at things that you don't usually look at economically. So it looks at driver safety through economics, and through climate change through economics. It also looks at how prostitution works in economic terms, so it's an odd book. Oh yeah, there's an interesting epilogue at the end, which basically shows that there are small monkeys that are kind of like humans in a sense, because if you experiment enough on monkeys, you can teach them how currency works, and they can start liking some food where they want it more, so they start trading currency, and they actually manage to make some monkey turn herself into a prostitute to get some coins issued by the scientists to get yourself more food. So yeah, you can do weird scientific experiments that show that some animals are much more like humans than we realize. And that they can actually understand money somehow. I don't know how, but that book talks about, among a lot of other things, how monkey can actually trade and trade really weird stuff. Next book I read, and I did not like this book at all, but I did review it, and it was a quite successful video, so that's something at least. And that is The End of the World. No, that's not what it's called. The End of the Beginning. No, it's not. What's it called? The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zihan, which is Peter Zihan's fourth book, which basically talks about how the world is gonna deglobalize, and we're gonna have mass famine probably. So he claims that you're gonna have 2 people be malnutritious and 2 billion people being malnutritious, and 1 billion people are gonna starve, and everyone's gonna deglobalize, and most of the world is screwed. China is screwed. And it makes a bunch of bogus predictions of how we're gonna have a large amount of deglobalization. I'm an optimist. I don't think we're gonna have that. Also, people are rational for the most part, so people understand that we need to collaborate to survive. We don't want to return to back 100 years where almost everyone was in poverty, compared to now where most people they're not rich, but they're doing okay. So I believe those trends are gonna continue, just slow down. But Peter Zihan is very popular for some reason, so there's a lot of Peter Zihan fans that were a bit angry at me when I made those 2 videos about Peter Zihan, criticizing him for his very strong opinions on how the world is gonna basically collapse, and the United States somehow is gonna be fine for the most part because it's oil independent, even though oil is dependent on other energy prices, and how some US industry sectors are connected to the global economy crucially. So deglobalization doesn't make any sense for the United States, and they don't show any sign of withdrawing from the world. We saw that with Biden. He's back in the world. But you got a lot of views. Yes, that was nice. My most popular video now is actually another video that I made on Peter Zihan books in general, which is, I made a video a few weeks ago where I evaluated the ideas of Peter Zihan in all of his 4 books. And that video, I think, has now 3,700 views maybe, which is nice. And it has also a lot of watch time, and it has a quite high view duration. And it's also gave me and that video specifically gave me 50 subscribers. And if you include everything else in practice, I got, I don't know how many subscribers, but just that video has given me in the past few weeks over 50 subscribers. And thanks to those 2 last videos on Peter Zihan, for the most part, now I have come up to 547 subscribers. So we've had exponential growth on this channel thanks to the Peter Zihan videos. But now I'm done with him. I'm gonna try to avoid making videos of him for the most part. So we're gonna find other stuff to review. So yeah. Moving on away from Peter Zihan now, we're moving on to a Swedish history book I read, or translated into Swedish. It's actually by a Norwegian historian, Terje Tvedt, but the translation is Världens historia, which means world history. My father, hello from Lisbeth. Hello, Lisbeth. And this is a book by a Norwegian historian, Terje Tvedt, World History, which talks about the history of the world. And if in university, you learn that the difference between world history and global history is that global history is just looking at how the world is interconnected, while world history focuses on civilizations. And this you can actually see in this book, because there's one chapter focusing on the first civilizations. So what was it? The Sumerians in the Euphrates. You had the Indus Valley civilization. My father, Meow from Lucky. Oh yeah, that cat is around somewhere. And then the Nile civilization around Egypt. That was the first chapter. Second chapter talked about the Chinese civilization during the Middle Ages and the Ottoman Empire. And it also talks a lot about the Nile River and the importance of waterways through history. And there's a chapter on why the West succeeded before everyone else, and he argues that it's kind of because of the waterway system, geography that England has, which allowed it to create an empire throughout the world, and how a lot of the empire in Africa is actually based around the Nile River, which passes from Egypt through Sudan all the way down to Kenya and Uganda, I think. So yeah. And then there's also a chapter on the rise of the United States and if China is going to be a successful challenger. And finally, there's a chapter on climate change, talking about how climate change has always affected the history. And it's not a doomsayer tale about that, but it also is not too optimistic, so it's quite worried about that. My father, I am in Switzerland, Lucky is in Belgium. Oh yeah, yeah. My father is currently vacationing in Switzerland. I'm currently vacationing in Finland, although I've vacationed earlier in Canada this summer. And the cat Lucky that you saw a few live streams ago, he's hanging out somewhere in Belgium. So yeah, the world history book, I liked it a lot. Yeah, I don't. If there's an English translation, you should definitely read it. It's by Terje Tvedt, so maybe you can find some history book by him. He's really fascinated by the Nile, that guy, for some reason. Next book I read is actually a Harry Turtletaub book, and it's one of my least favorite Harry Turtletaub books, and it's Days of Infamy. So if you remember a few live streams ago, I talked about how I was intending to read and review the Days of Infamy duology, so Days of Infamy and End of the Beginning. But then I read Days of Infamy, and it's 500 pages, which is not that bad for me, but it took me about, I think, 3 weeks to read or something like that, because it was just drawn out for me, and there were some interesting moments. I gave it a 3 out of 5 on Goodreads, but a lot of the characters were just forgettable and boring, and some of the interesting stuff of how the Japanese treat the Americans was interesting, and how Japanese handled diplomacy, but the characters were very forgettable. There were 2 Japanese officers they kept talking about, Genda and Fushida, and I cannot distinguish one from the other. The book ends with so the Japanese have conquered Hawaii after 100 or 200 pages in this book, and they end up setting up a puppet king in Hawaii. That's how the book ends, and there's a sequel that I have around the End of the Beginning, but I took this book off my TBR list because I did not enjoy this book that much. I had to push myself to finish reading it, so there was good, decent moments, but there was a lot of boring stuff. For example, there's some Hawaiian guy who just goes surfing. That's a large part of the book. So yeah, it's a bit sad with alternate history when I think about it, because if I think of the alternate history stuff I've read this year, I've only read William's Library, worse than Rule Britannia, so I'm not really sure William's Library. So I think that in my ratings previously, I may have been too generous. So if I would give a rating to Days of Infamy, it would maybe be a 6 out of 10, but then originally I did give Rule Britannia a 5 out of 10, a 6 out of 10 rating, but if I had to reevaluate it now, I would probably give it a lower rating because most of the book is very boring. It's just the last 2 chapters that are really interesting. Yeah, there are a bunch of reviews I made on this channel that are probably a bit outdated, because for some reason I was very generous with my ratings, but I'm reining that in now. But is it worse than Rule Britannia? I don't know. I really don't like how Shakespeare characters talk, so no, it's not as bad probably. But it was worse. It was certainly worse than 3 Miles Down, because that had some interesting humor. It was not that long, so although there was a bunch of boring stuff and it was not that interesting, that was only 300 pages. Days of Infamy is 500 pages, and I pushed myself to read that. But I'm not gonna read its sequel. That's another 500 pages. I intended to read that this summer, but I'm not gonna bother reading that because it's not worth it. There are some alternate history books I still wanna read, but I'm gonna be reading less and less alternate history throughout the years. And I'm gonna, proportionally, it's gonna be more and more non-fiction that I'm gonna read probably. And I'm gonna read some other authors possibly, or focusing on some specific authors. So I may read a bunch of Crichton next year, maybe some Robert Harris, although I don't know, maybe some Ken Follett, we'll see. Yeah. Next book I read, Viticol, what would you be your favorite art history timeline? I would definitely say, what's it called? Timeline 191, the Southern Victory series, that I loved. Although it goes crazy towards the end, but that's an 11 volume series by Harry Turtledove. Starts with the Confederates winning the American Civil War, then moves on to World War One, World War Two between the United States and the Confederates. And you have some fascist guy who rises, a fascist Nazi guy who comes into power in the Confederacy and does horrible things to blacks. And I really liked that book series. I really loved it. I did a short video on it, 5 reasons why you should read the Southern Victory series. And although it's not plausible at all towards the end, I think I did watch a video on the plausibility of it, and it stays plausible for the most part for the World War One section and the Civil War section, but then World War Two and the interwar period goes crazy. But that was just fun alternate history that I really enjoyed. And people say that Harry Turtledove writes characters that are boring and suck. I don't agree with that. It depends on the book, and I like the characters of Southern Victory. A lot of good characters, and it's quite nuanced, some of the characters of Harry Turtledove, where you have a guy, for example, who goes from a pretty good guy who's a friend with a black guy, but that guy towards the end of the series ends up a death camp commandant who puts people in gas chambers. So it's a quite dark book series. There's a lot of brutal war scenes that are well written. You have people across the political spectrum, and you also have women, and you have blacks, and you have rich people, and you have poor people. You have soldiers, you have sailors. Some of the sailors were a bit boring. The sailor scenes where it talks about Navy people and people going fishing, I did not really enjoy those parts of the story, but for the most part, I really loved the Southern Victory series. But I may be reaching a point in alternate history where I've read all the good stuff, so there's not that much good alternate history left to read. Even by Harry Turtledove, possibly. I do have a lot of alternate history left by Harry Turtledove to read. I have, for example, the Cross Time Traffic YA series by him to read. I'm gonna give that a chance. Hopefully I like that because I have all 6 volumes. But I'm not gonna read the sequel to Days of Infamy. And I don't have the energy anymore to just... A lot of fiction I read, it's not enjoyable, so I'm gonna stop reading it and not bother reviewing it each month. Now it's just non-fiction books review each month, and also some listicles and things like that, other book-related topics. By the way, if you want me to do some... if you have an idea of something I should do on this YouTube channel as a book-related stuff, you can always just suggest it, whether doing some book ranking or something like that, or some book tag. Next book is The Housing Boom and Bust by Thomas Sowell. And this is another... Thomas Sowell is my favorite non-fiction writer. He's an economist. And he wrote a book which talks about what caused the 2008 financial crisis. And what actually caused it was that you had regulators who pushed people to make out really, really bad loans to people because they wanted to have more home ownership for the poor, and they want to lower interest rates. But the problem when you do that is that you have people who are bigger risk factors that you're giving loans out to, and those people default, they don't pay back their loans, so you have a bubble forming and getting bigger and bigger, and eventually that popped when people realized people could not pay back their loans, and that screwed up the economy. So that's book, if you want to learn kind of what the 2008 financial crisis was caused at, one thesis, then you should check out that Housing Boom and Bust book by Thomas Sowell, or my review of it. Yeah. Next book, now we're gonna move to a couple of books. I have 2 books that I have left to talk about, and I actually have them with me here in Finland. Let's see, so not these books. So next up we have Airframe by Michael Crichton. And once again, this is my least favorite Michael Crichton book. I gave it on Goodreads 3 out of 5 stars. So a lot of this story was boring. It's a book about an aircraft accident, and people are investigating, and it's about, okay, Find out what the cause is, otherwise we're gonna lose a contract with the Chinese to sell airplanes. And there was some interesting elements, but for the most part it's just talks about technology that's not that interesting necessarily. My father, where did you get it? Oh yeah, airframe. Oh yeah, this I got at Pell Mell. Yes, Pell Mell. And I can see this cost 1.5 euros. Which means, although I did not really like that book that much, it's not that big of a loss because, hey, I paid 1.5 euros for this, which is what's about $2. And it was still not that bad. It was not a bad story per se. The last 100 pages, especially last 50 pages, were really thrilling. And there were some good thrills throughout the story, interspersed in some of the boring stuff. So it's a mixed bag of a book. It's maybe a 6 out of 10 or a 7 out of 10 or so, I would say, Airframe by Michael Crichton. So this would not be a sci-fi book, although it's not really even sci-fi, it's just an airplane investigation. But there are a lot of better Michael Crichton novels to read. And I'm afraid that the coming Michael Crichton books I'm gonna read now may not be that good. I wanna read everything by Michael Crichton, although if I don't like a book after 100 pages by him, I may give up on it. But that did not happen with this book. But I read already Michael Crichton's really good stuff probably, so I'm afraid I'm gonna come to the stuff that's less good. But we'll see with that. I'll talk about that in future wrap-ups. I have 5 books remaining to read by Michael Crichton, and I intend to read all of them, and I will probably read them in the coming year and a half. William, sorry, have you thought about joining booktube reading events? Hosting one takes more work, but participating can be fun. I could host a book reading event, although I'm not really sure. First of all, my book reading interests, I think they don't what's it called? They don't converge that much with other booktubers. I'm a lot of a non-fiction guy, so I don't know if what I would be organizing a book reading event about. Maybe I could organize some book reading event where we just read Stephen King for a month or something like that, but I don't know. You would have to help me with suggestions or explain me how that would work, Williams Library. I'm not that big of an organizer. I did join I do a lot of self-planning, but not a lot of group planning. I did join the honors program in my history program that I'm gonna return to, so I may learn some organizing skills there, but I'm not sure how I could organize a book event. I probably can find the time, but yeah, you would have to explain to me how that works. Yeah, so Airframe by Michael Crichton, it's okay. And then the final book I'm gonna talk about, which there will be a review out of this tomorrow night, so you can check that out. It's The Revenge of Geography by Robert Kaplan, which was a really good book, almost a great book. And it talks about geography. It talks about how crucial geography is to understand our world today. And it talks about the history of geopolitical thought leaders. It for example, debunks the Nazi distortion. So it talks about how you should not associate geopolitics with the Nazis. There are actually a bunch of geopoliticians that demonstrated how the Nazis misrepresented geopolitics for their own ends. But this book talks about realism and liberalism and both of its limits. But it goes around the world analyzing countries, regions through their geographies. So there's a chapter on Europe, there's a chapter on Russia, there's a chapter on China, a chapter on India, and then a couple of chapters on the Middle East, mainly through the spectrum of Iran and Turkey. It was a really interesting book, and the final chapter is about how the United States' main national interest is to have a good relation with Mexico, since you have cartels there, and you have a bunch of instability, and a wealthy, developed, stable, democratic Mexico is the best thing the United States could have. They also have a bunch of immigrants who are coming to the United States now from Mexico, so the United States really needs to have good relations with a stable Mexico. That's one of the main theses of the book. But Robert Kaplan is a realist, but he's a moderate realist, so he does understand the importance of human rights and liberal universal values, but he tempers them with a dose of geography and showing you that you need to understand the limits of what you can realize. So he explains in this book, in the beginning of the book, for example, how, yeah, interventions did work in Kosovo because you only needed air support, really. They didn't work in Iraq because of the geography in large part. So how the Arab Spring, for example, worked out partially, that's he connects that to geography, so that's why it was initially more successful in a place like Tunisia and Egypt, which are coherent nation states, compared to Libya or the Arab states. Those are not as coherent countries, so that's why the Arab Spring failed a lot more badly there than in Egypt or Tunisia. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here. It talks about the ways also that how a lot of these countries have the potential to liberalize and democratize. It also talks about the relative decline of the United States, but also still the important role it has in this world. So this is a very nuanced book about geopolitics. A lot. It's a. It's my second favorite Robert Kaplan book behind. What's it called? Asia's Cauldron. I prefer this book to Monsoon, although Monsoon is also good because although this book does drone on and on a bit about the history of geopolitics, the geopolitical analysis of different countries was very interesting, although it's a little over optimistic even for my taste at times. But yeah, Robert Kaplan is, when I think of it, he may be my second favorite non-fiction writer, and he's certainly my favorite geopolitics writer, and I may review more books on his channel by him, because I own another I own another Robert Kaplan book that I've got in the Netherlands, and then my father has another couple of Robert Kaplan books in Belgium that I may borrow to read. So yeah. And those were the 16 books that I have read. So that's the wrap up from the past few months. And currently I am reading also 2 books. So I'm reading A Place Called Freedom by Ken Follett. You can see I'm a bit over halfway through with this book, which is about, it's basically a coal miner versus an aristocrat in Britain in the late 1700s. So it's an interesting story that kind of makes you sympathize with workers and hates aristocrats during the 18th century. So I'm liking it so far, although there's although there's a lot of romance, which I don't really know how I feel about that. Oh, this I also got at Pell Mell, by the way. This look at the quality. It's decent quality of this book, but I got this for €3, €3.50. So yeah, used bookstores in Belgium are pretty good. And I'm also reading, and I've had this book for several years now. It's Give Me a Break by John Stossel. John Stossel is a libertarian news anchor. My father, excellent. Yeah, Pell Mell is excellent. John Stossel is a libertarian news anchor. He also has a decent following on YouTube. I do watch a lot of his YouTube videos, and I don't read that much of just libertarian stuff to feel good about myself. But this is this guy. This is one of the heroes for modern libertarians nowadays. So it's so I thought appreciation for him. I'm reading his book, and it's an interesting book. It talks about a lot of bureaucratic overreach. It also talks about how he started his career in journalism, and how they just sometimes too easily believe experts without doing their due diligence and looking up the facts. And things are often exaggerated in this book. So yeah. William Snyder, did not Stossel get beaten from a wrestler? There's a video. Oh yeah, I actually looked at this book. There's he talks about this in this book. He got hit by a wrestler, and he has images towards the middle of the book where he shows where he was slapped. I'm gonna find it here. Here, I don't know if you can see this. You can see him getting slapped here. Yeah, look at this. Yeah, he got slapped by this bastard because this guy got angry because Stossel basically told him, yeah, wrestling is fake. He talks about a bunch of scammers in this book, and usually people just smile and nod and basically lie to you straight to your face. But this guy just got angry. So a tough guy that's maybe not that smart. So yeah. So those were the books that I've read in the past few months. So I don't know if you have anyone has any questions, you can ask me now if you want to. Um, for my father, yeah, yeah, interesting smiley face, yeah. Yeah, some people don't care, they just can attack journalists randomly. Yeah. But for this channel, you can expect 1 or 2 book reviews a month or so, and then a few other different book-related videos. My father, I also read quite a few books. Oh yeah, good. Oh, Ship Wars, that's a geopolitics book that I might review next year, or I don't think. Oh yeah, the new map. I expect that I wanna. That's a book I expect that I will review possibly in September or sometime this year. I really wanna read the new map this year. That's the geopolitics book about the energy sector and climate change and things like that. Oh yeah, and my father also read Russia's Lifesaver. Yeah, my father has read quite a bit for himself in the past few months, which is good. Gregory Girshik. Any other geopolitics authors beyond Kaplan on the radar? Gregor, let's see. So, yeah, Robert Kaplan is the best one. But Tim Marshall is also pretty good. His geopolitics stuff is a bit basic. Talks about geopolitics in general, but he's written a bunch of good books. So Tim Marshall, he's written Prisoners of Geography. That's a good book. Power of Geography, that's pretty good. Let's see, The Age of Wars or Divided. That's a decent book about wars. Then there's also the recent book he released called Future of Geography, which talks about space politics, space geopolitics. So yeah, Tim Marshall you can also check out. I'm actually thinking about making another video where I'm gonna talk about another 5 geopolitics books you should check out. But let's see. So you've got Robert Kaplan and Tim Marshall. Who else? Any other geopolitics author? I don't agree with what John Mersheimer writes necessarily, but he does write thought-provoking geopolitics. So something like the Israel lobby and U.S. foreign policy. That's a decent book. Did you read any books by Guy Sorman? Guy Sorman. I have never heard of that guy, but after this live stream, I will Google who that guy is. Well, I don't know who that is. But let's see. Now there are some other authors that are good. They're not necessarily geopolitics authors, but they do write international relations. There's The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd. That's a good book which talks about the conflict between China and the United States in a quite nuanced way. Henry Kissinger, I'm pretty sure he's written a lot of good stuff. I've only read one book by him, World Order, but that was a decent book. And I do intend to read On China by him sometime in the coming couple of years. So I want to read more stuff by him. Any other authors? Let's see. I don't recommend Peter Zian at all, by the way. I used to recommend him. I don't trust. He offers no sources. I don't trust, and he exaggerates a lot with his predictions, and he just goes very far. So not him. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I do have a long playlist of a bunch of geopolitics books that you can check out, and I'm giving a lot of good ratings. So yeah, there are several different authors. But Robert Kaplan is the main one, and then Tim Marshall is a pretty good second that you should check out as geopolitics authors. Those are the 2 main ones. Otherwise, I'm not sure. I absolutely do not I'm gonna give an opposite thing of recommendation. I would say avoid Peter Zian and avoid George Friedman, because those guys make predictions without really including sources, or it's basically predictions without looking at how things are in reality. When you read geopolitics, you should be reading geopolitics about today, and then from that you can infer future predictions, but you should not read a geopolitics book that really makes predictions about the future for the most part. Yeah. Grigorin Grishik, I recommend Empire of Lies by Guy Sorman. It is about China. Oh, I think I've seen somewhere Empire of Lies. I thought that was a book. about slavery or something. No, I've never heard of that, but I'll check that. I'll take a look into that. But I've got a lot of interesting geopolitics book to read about Asia. So I've got Bully of Asia, which is a quite negative perspective on China. I've got The Great Conversions, which is an optimistic geopolitics book. I've got some book by Noam Chomsky, which hates the West. You know, I don't know how, but I'm sure it does. I've got a book called The Digital Silk Road, which is about Chinese digital technology. So there's a lot of interesting geopolitics book I want to read and review. And who knows, there may even be a month where I review 2 geopolitics books. By the way, I do intend to review also at least 1 Jared Diamond book this year. I think I'm gonna try to review Collapse this year if I find the time. So yeah. But if there are any geopolitics book suggestions, then feel free to suggest them. I'm always looking out for more of them. So yeah. Williams Library, Empire of Lies. That's the 3rd book with the same title I know of. Unoriginal. Oh, that's why I heard Empire of Lies, yeah. Also the title End of the Beginning, or yeah, I have 3 books that have very similar titles. The End of the World is just the beginning, the End of the Beginning, and then I've got the book The End and the Beginning. So yeah, that's confusing. I've also got 2 Cosa Nostra books. I've got a bunch of books with geography in their title. Yeah, I've got some books that have basically the same title. That's just how people are. They write the books with the same titles. They're not original necessarily. There's a book that I want to read someday, but and I'm thinking of calling it something like The Rise of Modern Liberty. I think that's a decently original title, which talks about the growth of individual freedom in the last 500 years. So yeah. But given that I've talked about all the books I thought of talking about, I'm gonna start closing the live stream soon. So unless anyone has any final comments, the next reading wrap up I'm gonna do. So I'm thinking about doing them maybe every 2nd month. That's more fun because if I did that every month, I wouldn't have that many books to talk about. 16, that's a lot. So. And I also maybe intend to start reading less books more and more because I'm gonna try to read Foreign Affairs in September and October. So when I return back to the Netherlands, I'm gonna go to the train station, get myself a copy, 200 pages of Foreign Affairs, and I'm gonna try to read that through. And I do intend to make a video about it. What are my thoughts of reading a magazine of Foreign Affairs? So yeah, I may only read 3 books a month soon, or just 4 books a month. So yeah, I'm not sure how often I'm gonna do wrap-ups. Although if there's some live stream suggestion anyone has of a topic I should do a live stream about, then I could maybe do that. Yeah. But otherwise, thanks everyone for watching this live stream. Remember to check out the book review of The Revenge of Geography if you're interested tomorrow by Robert Kaplan. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader. Thanks guys for joining me, and I will see you readers next time. Goodbye.